Welcome back. This is the Sell Like a Leader podcast, the podcast for revenue leaders who are on a mission to cultivate a high-performing sales team within their organization. I'm your host, David Kreiger, founder of Sales Roads, America's most trusted sales outsourcing and appointment setting firm. Today, we are bringing you another great revenue leader, Brian Signorelli. Brian began his career as a research analyst at Gartner in 2007, where he advised Fortune 500 executives on leadership challenges. He started his tech career at HubSpot in 2012 as one of the first 50 account executives. And he held leadership roles at HubSpot for 9 years as the company grew from 30 million to over $1 billion in annual revenue. Brian has since held senior sales positions at Vendr and Lattice, and he is now an advisor to Tome, a really interesting AI company, which we'll dive into. Brian also published Inbound Selling in 2018, detailing HubSpot's sales playbook. He's currently developing an online training course for earlycareersellers.co. Brian, thanks so much for joining us on the Sell Like a Leader podcast.
Great. Thank you, David. Appreciate it. And excited to be here with you.
Let's dive into it. So what I'd love to chat with you a bit about today is the steps a leader need to take when they come into a new company, what they need to do in the first couple of months, which obviously are critical in figuring out your strategy, proving yourself to your leadership, proving yourself to your team, and really trying to figure out what is going to drive long-term success in your sales portfolio. And so you recently joined Tome as an advisor, and previously you were leading a sales team at Lattice. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the framing with you coming in as an advisor to Tome, some of the things that you thought about when you were coming in to Lattice. So when you're joining a new team, what are some of the lessons that you bring specifically, let's start from Lattice to your advisor role at Tome?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share some perspective there. I think that like big picture to answer the question, what do you do in the first couple of months as you want to get the team going or set a vision or strategy? I think it's totally dependent on the context that you're walking into. Lattice, for example, was a $70 million business growing probably 30 or 40% year over year. When I left, well over 100 million of ARR with 500 or 600 employees. That's a very different context than Tome, which has had a ton of success in its own right, but had decided to make a pivot away from applying generative AI to building slide decks, which I think is a clever application because a lot of people struggle with that. It's not super easy. And they had 20 million active users to show for it. But even in spite of that, they said, I think that we want to go even bigger. We want to do something different. And so they completely, quote, pivoted to reinvent themselves towards serving sellers and sales leaders, mostly in mid-market and enterprise, still applying generative AI there. So I think that the context matters. Tome is really trying to go from 0 to 1 again, whereas Lattice was trying to go from, call it 100 million to 500 million or maybe a billion. And the teams look totally different. I mean, Tome didn't even necessarily have, I think, its first customer when I started. So if you're joining the super early stage, or even if you do have your first handful of customers, it's still all about customers are really the only thing that matters. Your potential users. You're going to have a hypothesis on the problem you think you're solving. Your customers will lead you over time to understanding the true nature of the pain and the extent to which the pain is real. So anyway, that's, I think, the earlier stage. The later stage, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that your customers are definitely still going to lead you to most of the right answers. The difference is that you moved into a different part of, I think, the product like life cycle curve or the market adoption curve, where, very early on, you're looking at like early innovators, early adopters, people who have a really high tolerance with testing new technology. This is why most businesses start selling to very small businesses in the first place. They just have a much higher risk tolerance to try new things. But as you mature and grow, you're getting into kind of like the early majority. And as you get into the early majority and go up that growth curve, the good news is that the market is a lot larger. The bad news is that like the tolerance for like jankiness and things that don't work so well is quite a bit lower. And then on top of that, you have so many more people. You have so many more kind of cooks in the kitchen. You have so many more mature functions. You have like usually much larger sales teams, more marketing people. You have a customer success and service team. And so it's both, I think at a later stage, the first thing that I would spend time on is people sliced a couple of different ways. So I want to understand from my AE's perspective, what's working, what's not. From my manager's perspective, what's working, what's not. From my CRO's perspective, what's working, what's not. From my customer's perspective, I want to get on 20, 30 plus customer calls, or at least listen to recordings through tools like Gong and otherwise, to really understand like what is the nature of like where are we at in terms of skill, in terms of what customers want, competitive landscape, et cetera. And that should inform at least some of your early thinking on where people are at and how that might influence or inform your early vision and strategy in the first few months.
I want to dissect a few things there. I think there is a pressure that sales leaders feel when they come into an organization where they need to have, or they feel like they need to have all the answers. But what you said, Brian, which I like, and I've also seen the best sales leaders do this, is that you listen first and you spend time just hearing, not telling, not giving all the ideas, not the whole strategy, right? You got to learn, bring your perspective and your acumen to it, but you've got to learn from the AEs, listening to calls, what's working, what's not working, from the executive team, from especially your customers. And so I think that's an awesome perspective in some ways, even though obviously all sales leaders have tremendous amounts of pressure to perform really quickly. It's important to have that perspective. You sometimes have to slow down a little bit at the beginning before you move forward, because you got to have something that you can use to leverage to craft that strategy, because you can't have all the answers just coming in.
I agree. And there's sales, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but there is a little bit of a concept of bravado, I think, in the sales profession, of chest pounding a little bit, which I think is mostly dying out, but still exists in pockets. But I think that there is this, even in spite of that, I think there is this concept of fake it till you make it, or having overconfidence. And I don't actually think that serves people really well. I think that leads to, I've seen so many times leaders come in, and I'm guilty of this myself, where I'll come in and say, oh, the way we did it at HubSpot was blah, blah, blah. The way we did it at Vendr was blah, blah, blah. That's great. And that might work, but it also might not. You're just dealing with a different context, usually different customer set, different leadership team. There's a lot of variables. And what worked in those previous contexts may or may not work in the new one. And so it's not to say that the leader shouldn't be confident or have conviction in some of the things they're thinking or putting forth for the team, even if they might be a little bit uncertain. But I do think that leaving yourself at least a little bit open to the possibility that you're wrong, as we often are, or at least we're not going to get every single thing right. I think that's ultimately going to lead to much better decisions for the business and for your customers, which frankly are the only things that actually should matter. If you're not solving for a customer, you're not solving for the business outcome, then who are you solving for? Probably yourself.
And I think the other intangible thing, you approach it this way, and you said first is people. And the intangible part about approaching this the way that you said is that you've got to earn the respect. There's lots of ways to earn respect, but earn the respect in the right way, where your team is going to trust you, that they are going to know that you are going to empower them, things like that. And the best way to do it is not to come in and say, I've got all the answers and here's what you're going to do. It's to listen and ask them for what their opinions are. And you're not going to go with all their opinions, but they're going to be a lot of things you didn't think about. And when you are just through the action of asking them, first of all, that is a huge part of gaining the trust of the team that you're working with. But then you're also going to have a lot of ideas that you didn't have from people who've been here in the trenches a lot longer than you. And so it's just a win. And so looking at it through the context of Tome, because I think this is really interesting when we look at coming into an organization, they have some current customers and things like that, but you're potentially looking to service them in a bit of in a vastly different way. How do you create that approach of trying to ask some of the questions when everything, like you said, is new? Do you just have to then come up with some hypotheses and then test them? Or can you walk us through a little bit of the specific difference of a Tome versus a Lattice?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit. I wasn't there for it, but one of Tome's co-founders, Keith Paris, and their now head of sales, Justin King, they, I think, did exactly what I would have advised them to do. So at least from that perspective, they didn't need me as an advisor, so to speak. They had so many, literally millions of users on their original product. And when they had the hypothesis of, could we serve sales leaders? The good news is they already had tons of sales leaders and sellers that were part of the user base. And they spent time, I think, doing at least, I want to say 50 or 100 different first person research interviews with their users, with those sales leaders and those sellers. And I think initially they said something like, yeah, what do you think of like, we built this Gen AI tool to build like slides more effectively. What if we kind of reposition to help your sales team rapidly build like their pitch decks? And I think the feedback was like, why would you do that? That's one of the last things that we care about. Like, we have pitch decks, they suck. Like, no customers really take them seriously anyway. Thank you, but that's not the thing. And so naturally, the next question that I think Keith and Justin started asking was like, okay, so what's the thing? Like, what if we could solve like any of your things with generative AI, what would it be? And the number one thing that they talked about consistently was, is there a way for you to help us really understand which accounts we should be trying to break into, and then how to have really relevant, timely messaging to get the attention of the executives that we want to talk to? And that kind of spurred the product roadmap initially as to where Tome went. So, when I talk about very early stage listening to your customers, if you don't have any customers yet, that's fine. Go find your hypothetical customers, your potential like ICP, go talk to them, really walk a mile or 10 for that matter in their shoes, or try to come with kind of very open mind, curious mind, to try to figure out like what are the most pressing problems. And then once you get a little bit of a theme from those first, say, 3 to 10 conversations, then it's a matter of prioritizing and see if you can like revalidate through the next 10 conversations, And I'm pretty sure that team spent at least, I want to say 6 to 12 months, like doing the research and the validation before they went into more of a product build mode. And they're in that very late stage of getting that initial product out now. But it was preceded by a lot of that research, really by just having genuinely great conversations with their prospective customers.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It takes a lot of guts to, how many users did you say that they had?
I think they had over 20 million on their like
20
initial core product. Yeah.
Wow. So that takes a lot of guts to really go in a different direction. And I think that methodical approach makes a lot of sense, especially since you've got a base. You only want to make that change if you really have a good hypothesis as to what is next there. So I love, we touched a little bit on people. And when you come into a new organization, and you can draw on any of the different experiences, obviously, but if you're coming in as a leader, you talked about talking to your team and understanding them, but obviously there are also a role for understanding and benchmarking your team. And making sure you have the right people in place, because you can have the best strategy in the world. If you don't have the right people to execute it or to sell on it, it's not going to work. So do you have any perspective, or what advice would you give to leaders who are coming into an organization, there is an existing team, how to evaluate them and figure out who is you want to have as part of your team?
Yeah, I think again, this is going to be different depending on, are you very early stage, are you much later stage? If you're later stage, when I started Lattice, for example, I had a concept in my mind. I had a benchmark in my mind from working at HubSpot and remembering, okay, what were we doing around like the 80 to 100 million ARR mark? And I remember we had really high command of the different KPIs and metrics that we held the sales team to. We had really transparent reporting and communication on, people's performance. And I'm talking down to the individual, like daily activity, discovery calls run, demos run, deals won, dollar value, like everything you would need in one place to really understand where are we producing relative to the targets every month. We thought about, we had this thing called a monthly rep pack, which went out to every single AE and every sales leader, and it would show you. And today you'd probably see it like in a Looker or a Tableau or something like that. Back then it was in Excel. This is not even 7 or 8 years ago, but it would have every single seller statistic benchmarked against every other seller. So you could see exactly like what was your conversion rate from discovery call to second meeting, from second meeting to demo to negotiation, et cetera. What was your loss rate? What was your win or loss rate against specific competitors? What's total number of calls you're running, or how's your pipeline progressing over time? What's total amount of pipeline? What's the source of your pipeline? All those different things. What it really helped sellers understand was, what are the best sellers doing? And is it any different from what I'm doing? And so what it helped the seller and the leaders do was understand, what are the top AEs doing, and where are there the potential gaps for maybe like your B and C players that you want to move the C's into the B's into the A's. So yes, there's like tons of these KPIs and metrics you can look at, especially at the later stage. And you also want to look at things like, I think, maturity of sales process. Do they have defined sales stages? Do they have clear entry exit criteria? I think understanding how business forecasts is also a pretty good indicator of the extent to which it's mature. So I won't be too specific here, but certain businesses that I'd been in have literally, and I also lived through this at HubSpot, where we went from having really no concept of forecasting, where the forecast was like, let me take a look at the deals I have here. I think these are coming in. That might be fine very early on, but as you get bigger and bigger, I mean, you know, it's all about predictability and being very accurate, especially in the VC world, being very accurate with delivering on exactly what you say you're going to deliver on. Because ultimately, if you're shooting for the moonshot of the IPO, guess what Wall Street cares about? They want beat and raise every single quarter. And so if you're not incredibly accurate and have a super high command in your business, you are going to get punished. Because I think like all sorts of investors pay for, yes, growth, but also predictability over time. I think earlier on, I'm not sure I'd look at any of those things. I'd be measuring AEs really on the quality of conversations they're having. The early stage AEs are really more like product managers, especially before you get to that first million, 2 million of ARR. It's actually not about the revenue growth. It's about your retention and making a product that's so good that a customer says, I would be very disappointed if this was no longer something I could use, or like you want to get into, I have to have this type of category. But to get there, I think you need an incredibly intellectually curious and detail oriented AE who is really good at taking notes, is really good at working with the product team, sharing specific feedback and sound bites with them, from the customers with them, to kind of like continuously iterate to get to that so-called product market fit initially, where you go through your first renewal cycle or two, and ideally you're at 100% net revenue retention or more.
I feel like I should have had this thought before, but I think it makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't thought about it, is that the type of AE you want for an early stage startup, definitely pre-product market fit, potentially even early product market fit, because you're still going to need to iterate a lot and really understand what's working and what's not working, is different than the AE that can run a process and just really go after it. And the disposition and kind of the skill set is different for both of those, because curiosity is good in different ways. But if you just get mired in curiosity when you're a later stage AE and you have to execute on the process, you're not going to hit your number, right?
Totally.
And if you just want to run the process early on, you're not going to get the insights that the product team needs. So that's really interesting, Brian. Maybe I should have, but I hadn't thought about it through that prism before. That's great.
Yeah, it's not something that's been in my face constantly. It's just something that, like, over a long stretch of time, I've just kind of noticed that you especially notice it when you're in a context where the seller is out of place. So, if you're like at Lattice, there were some sellers that were just excellent with they would come in and say, like, just give me the playbook. I'm going to memorize the playbook on my own. I know exactly how to pick accounts. I know exactly how to get my prospecting activity up. I know exactly how much pipeline to build. Like, they know what it takes to succeed when you're at scale and you're into like a territory model and a segmentation model. And it's really more about like, how do you capture as much of the market as you possibly can? Because once you're at that like 50, 100 million in sales, like, it's really about it's really about getting to ubiquity as quickly as you can, because of course there's going to be competitors like in the market. And so how do you stand out and rapidly gain that market share? But I've seen some AEs that do that really well. And I've seen other AEs that are like, oh yeah, like I just ran like a 2-hour demo with this customer. And I'm like, why? Like, we don't, like, there's no value in doing that. I'm glad that you created like a one-off, very good customer experience, but the stage we're at, that makes no sense. Whereas if I were a leader at a pre-product market fit, pre-revenue, maybe even sub $1 million or $2 million, I'd say that's great. And my question will be, what did you learn?
Yeah.
What are the top 1 or 2 or 3 things that you learned? And yeah, I wouldn't say wildly different skill sets, but very different. And then you got to change that over time as you go through the different stages of growth and scale.
Yeah, so to pull on this a little bit more, and maybe there may be differences, but maybe they are from your perspective. But given that prism where the skill set or what you're looking for from an AE is slightly different, right? At the end of the day, you still want both of them to sell. And when you're thinking about it as a sales leader and a manager through that prism, is there a difference between the type of training or management that the leader should be doing in those circumstances to foster that behavior If the AE has a slightly different skill set or perspective, is there something similar for the manager, or is it really just knowing that prism and then the leadership skills are still similar between the two companies?
No, I think that the types of managers I think even that you have in are probably going to look a little bit different at that later stage. And I think that they also err much more toward like high levels of accountability, inspection. Are we following the process? Where are things going well? Where are they not going well? Because really you're trying to get tens or hundreds. Like when I left HubSpot, there were already like 800 account executives globally. You're trying to basically figure out like, is everybody rowing in the same direction? And I like the kind of side thought I'll share here is one of the co-founders of HubSpot said this, but it's not his Dharmesh Shah. It's not his original idea. I don't think. I think it came from maybe Elon Musk. Regardless of whether or not you think he's controversial, I think he did have a really interesting point. He said the sum power of your company is the extent to which all your vectors are aligned. It's like very engineering, like physics concept. But if every person in your company is a vector and they're all pointed in different directions, then you add them all up, then that's going to amount to nothing. But if you point all the vectors in the same direction, then that is essentially going to be like the sum force of the progress you're going to be able to make over time. And that's, I think, why that's part of the reason why the inspection, the accountability, the process adherence, that's why that kind of stuff matters as you get to scale. Whereas early on, again, you're trying to go from 0 to 1. Like you're going to have to really understand what is the pain that you think you're solving. You're also going to need to like, I think, do a lot of like influence and inspiring people, again, depending on what exactly you're selling, who you're selling to. Are you building and are you doing a category creation, or are you like building a better mousetrap, so to speak, in an existing category? So yeah, I think that the skill sets I'd look for early on would be people that in a perfect world, I'd be looking for people who have actually been my ICP. So if I'm selling to accountants, like I might want to actually look for people who were like an accountant before. If I'm trying to sell to sellers, I might look for a seller. A marketer, might look for a marketer. I would be less concerned. I think this is part of honestly what made like some of the magic happen early on at HubSpot. A lot of the early salespeople at HubSpot did not actually have sales experience, myself included. But we did have a little bit of work experience, and people came from like myself. I was a research analyst, a consulting background. My manager was one of the most successful sales reps there. She was also from a consulting and research background. We had people from accounting, from insurance. Like we had former Olympic athletes. There were just a very motley crew of people. And so early on, I just think it's a very different game. That's like this witch's brew of some magic you're trying to create early on. Whereas later, it really is more about a machine.
Yeah, I like the analogy of the vectors and prism too, because I think it crystallizes what you're talking about in the sense, especially even from a management perspective, that at the beginning in any startup, the vectors are going to be going in lots of different directions. And you kind of want that because you want experimentation, and you want the type of manager who can facilitate that, can start seeing where the vector should point, right? And understand that. But then the second, and sometimes the sales leader is talented enough to do both, just like some founders can start a company and grow it, but sometimes it's two different skills. And the second part is just that person who now knows where the vectors are going and can keep them going the right direction. So I do want to make sure we touch on AI, especially with what you're doing at Tome, before we get into rapid fire questions. From your perspective, could you talk a little bit about your perspective on AI and how you think it's going to fit in this debate of replacing salespeople, aiding salespeople? What is it? I think there's certain processes that maybe are more likely to be changed. Can you talk about what those are and just your overall perspective on how this is impacting sales right now?
Yeah, it is a hot topic. I think if you asked me 5 or 7 years ago, maybe longer, I'd say yes. Like I think Gen AI is going to probably replace salespeople someday. I think I've tempered a little bit of that perspective with having a little bit more experience and seeing things play out over time. I do think generative AI is just endlessly fascinating. To me, it's the same as, I'll like date myself here, but I remember the moment that I got access to AOL and got access to an internet browser for the first time, and it was just magical. And I really do feel that way about generative AI. Now, is it going to work from like a cost perspective and compute perspective? And are we ever going to get to AGI? I don't know. I hope we do, but I don't know. So anyway, in the here and now, I do think that trying to replace salespeople with AI is a fool's errand. Will we get there someday? Maybe. I don't know. I don't think the world's ready for that right now. I don't think buyers are receptive to that right now. I don't think that businesses have thought through all the potential risks that are associated with that. That said, I wouldn't suggest you be like a Luddite either. I would suggest that you embrace what AI can do today and what it can do. A lot of companies already exist at the application layer, leveraging the LLMs, doing things like account research, the way that Tome is helping, doing prospecting and finding intent signals, the way that businesses like Clay is like really fascinating, like wildly successful company based in New York, using Gen AI to do things like data enrichment or content creation, the way that you see companies like Copy AI doing just some wildly fascinating stuff here. Or even there's this other company that I've been following recently, founded by a former HubSpot I work with, called Triple Session, which is applying AI as a internal tool, as a sales management call coach, where it can ingest like hundreds of call recordings and spot areas of relative strength and weakness for A's. Like, that's wildly fascinating to me. And that was never, ever possible when I was a sales leader, and being able to like quickly spot these trends and be able to pinpoint where people, need help. I think that's where some of the magic happens today. So anyway, long way of saying, I think it's all about where sales teams and sellers can be more efficient, productive, and frankly, more relevant with the potential prospects and buyers that they reach out to. I think that's the biggest value add right now. Longer term, we'll see.
It is a fascinating time, I think, to be in sales and thinking through these technologies that I like you said, it allows salespeople to do what they should have been doing all along a lot more easily. So that's awesome. So what I'd love to do is we always end, Brian, with what we call our rapid fire questions. And so I've got a few for you. And I'll just throw them out at you if you can give your perspective on each one, and we'll run through it. Sound good?
Let's do it.
So what is one thing people don't give enough value or attention to in leadership?
I think recognizing when people are doing really good work. I think it's too easy to just gloss that over, but I think that taking that moment to say to a manager, to an AE, to really anybody, like in the front office or back office for that matter, and saying, thank you, I see you, that was awesome, I appreciate it. I think it happens, but I just don't think it happens enough.
Yeah, it's powerful. What is one skill you advise everyone in sales to master?
Transparent communication. I thought that this was like a given at most businesses. I was very lucky to see this at HubSpot. I don't know the root cause, but I just don't think transparent communication is like the norm everywhere. And I really think it should be.
Favorite business leadership or sales book?
This is really hard. My favorite business book is probably 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Peter Thiel, but I do respect his thinking, at least in this book. Super fascinating if you've never read it. And then from a sales perspective, I've got to go with like my sales. He's either like my sales grandfather or great grandfather, Mark Roberge. He was the first CRO of HubSpot. He wrote the Sales Acceleration Formula. Phenomenal book, pretty well known. It's probably my number one from a sales leadership perspective.
Yeah, great book, great guy. Favorite quote, mantra, or saying that inspires you as a sales leader?
I had this written down, and I'll share that. It's like this random plaque that somebody dropped on my desk one day, and it just said, "It can be done." And I carried that with me for a long time. I actually don't have it on my desk right now, but it's packed away somewhere. The other quote that I did write down, which I do like a lot, a little bit longer, is it says, "Water cuts through rock, not because of its power, but because of its persistence," which I'll just leave it at that. I'll let you think about that.
I love that. And lastly, what's the most important goal or project that you're working on right now?
I am 2.5 years into my tenure as a dad. So that's the most important project I'm working on right now. I've got a 2.5-year-old daughter, and I also have an 8-year-old dog. She's like my first daughter, so to speak, or at least fur daughter. Love them both. And so that's like my most important thing. The second up is, you mentioned this earlier, I'm working on an on-demand sales training course, earlier stage. It's all based on the HubSpot sales playbook that I learned and used myself, which you can find out more about if you want at quotarelief.co.
Brian, this was a great conversation. You got me thinking some things I hadn't thought about before. So really appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspectives, sharing your experience. If people want to connect with you, how should they do that? Where can they find you?
LinkedIn's the best. You'll find me. There are a bunch of Brian Signorellis, strangely, or maybe not so strangely. I don't know. But yeah, I'm the one based in Boston. I don't think there's more than one, as far as I know, based in Boston. So LinkedIn's the best way. Feel free to reach out, connect, follow, whatever.
Fantastic. So thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Sell Like a Leader. If you got some value out of today's episode, I know I did, please subscribe on your platform of choice. Also, always love to hear feedback from our listeners. You can always find me at David Kreiger. That's Kreiger. Not too many of us there, like the Brian Signorellis, but sometimes hard to find because of our spelling. But hit me up on LinkedIn. Love to hear from you. Any topics you want to hear from, any guests you think we should have on. And also, you can always find out more about Sales Roads at salesroads.com. Thanks so much for everyone tuning in. Brian, thanks so much for your time today.